Domestic violence in Australia. 1 in 3 Australian women will experience some form of family violence in their lifetime. 1 in 5 Australian women will experience some form of sexual abuse. We know that family violence is the leading cause of death, disability and injury to Australian women aged between 16 and 44. But what do we know about queer domestic violence? Today we're going to hopefully shine a light on the dark side of the rainbow. Hi, welcome to the show. I'm Anthony Lekkas, and today we're talking about domestic violence. Matthew and Russ from my other closet, the Cabaret. Thanks for chatting with me.
Hey, Anthony.
Nice to be here. Well, nice of you to come to our house and interview us
Great.
in our own lounge room.
Exactly, right. Well, it's a lovely space. Well, we are going into your home. We're going to be going very closely into your home, and in particular your home, Russ, and the history of your relationship, previous relationship of yours, which out of that relationship emerged this cabaret show about domestic violence. Why do a cabaret show about domestic violence?
It's a subject that there hasn't been a lot talked about. In fact, within our own community, the queer community, people tend to avoid the subject, and we felt that it was very important to expose the fact that people in queer relationships experience DV at pretty much the same rates, and some areas of the queer community experience it at even higher rates than the heterosexual community. However, we don't talk about it.
So if it's so prevalent in the community, why aren't we talking about it more often?
Well, I think what the research shows is that there's a couple of reasons why the queer community doesn't acknowledge domestic violence very well. Because the dominant message is so often conflated with men's violence against women. We say domestic violence, and half the time in the community, in the general community, we actually mean men's violence against women, or we say men's violence against women when we're talking about bigger and broader concepts. And so I think that heteronormative dominant discourse makes it really hard for queer people to even recognize that DV is what they're experiencing when they're in the thick of it. One of the other things that we know is there's an enormous pressure on the queer community. We've spent a long time trying to convince the rest of the world that our relationships are valid, that our love is equal, and so it's a lot to actually say, well, sometimes our relationships are toxic and they're really bad for us, just like the heterosexual community. But we have this extra pressure to be even more fantastic at relationships so that we could please get married and have the same amount of freedom and equality as you.
So if we don't have marriage equality yet in Australia here in 2017, so without that level of legitimacy, visibility, and I guess you're talking about protection also, then people in queer relationships, they're left thinking that what might be happening in their relationship is not like what happens in heterosexual relationships. This can't be domestic violence.
I think it's interesting that as a queer person, what are your gauges? How do you gauge that the relationship that you're in is a domestic violent relationship?
Well, Russ, how did you do it? Because we'll talk about the show in a minute, but what was your sense making along the way if we in queer relationships don't have a template for understanding abuse when it happens?
I guess in my own situation, it took me 5 years to get out of a relationship that was toxic, that was bad for me, because I didn't realise that I was in an abusive relationship. Again, there were no gauges. There was no one for me to talk to. There were no services available that were able to clarify what I was going through. And because of that, I actually didn't realise I was.
I think interestingly, when we first got together and were talking about that, I had some access to the sector, and so I did know a little bit about what are classic signs of domestic violence. And so for Russ to describe his past experience and for me to say, that's a classic tactic. That's, that is isolating you. That was that person, making you walk on eggshells. That was the wooing phase. That was the honeymoon phase. Like, to see how closely you can overlay the classic signs and symptoms from straight domestic violence situations, men's violence against women, onto many queer relationships. I think it was interesting for us to kind of have such an immediate, real example of that.
You mentioned the word clarity around not having clarity around it, and Matt, when you were talking then, did you have this conversation when you were sort of sharing those stages that you mentioned? Is that the clarity that you were sort of looking for, to try and sort of say, yes, that's me, that's what was happening?
When Matthew and I were having the conversation, I was well out of that relationship, so my clarity came to me in a thud. And that clarity was, the result, or the result of that clarity was broken bones and hospital visits and all sorts of things. So I realised where I was at much before these conversations were taking place.
Your clarity came to you in a thud, as you said, and I'm just wondering about, you used the word tactics earlier, Matt, around sort of tactics of abuse that are used against people in relationships, and we understand sometimes that people end up in hospital. That's up at the sort of pointy end of domestic violence, isn't it? Where sort of other people start to take what's happening in your relationship very seriously, because there are injuries, police might have come out. But what about sort of up the other end, sort of along the way, when you were sort of, was there a sense of, I'm not sure if this is domestic abuse, or was that just not something you considered because it just didn't exist in queer relationships, in our opinion?
I never had the words. I never ever had the words. I knew in myself, I believed that there was something not quite right about this relationship that I was in. It didn't happen on day one. It was something that was progressive, and it crept up on me.
What did you notice? What was the thing that crept up where you started to realise something's happening here?
For me, it was very much a change of attitude, a change of the way in which I was being treated. It was, just little niggly things that were coming into this relationship that I had that, at the 6-month mark, culminated in a broken nose. And that was really, from my perspective, that was the beginning of the violence. The first 6 months probably were very much grooming me for what was about to come.
If you've heard something in our conversation today that makes you think perhaps you're using control or abuse in your relationship, you can contact VAC at vac.org.au or QLife.
In our conversation today, it's made you think about anyone you know, maybe a colleague or a friend or a family member even, that this sounds like could be happening in their relationship. Please head to qlife.org and speak to a volunteer counsellor about what you might be able to do to help that person. Or you can go to anothercloset.com.au and have a look at the information there for how bystanders can help someone experiencing violence.
If anything in our conversation today has made you realise that maybe you're in a domestic violent relationship, contact Queerspace. They have a specialist LGBTI domestic violence support worker available to talk to you today. Alternatively, call QLife and talk to a volunteer counsellor.
Matt, can I just, and you've worked in the sector and you've worked in family violence and you're a family violence researcher. When you met Russ and he started to share this story with you, what was some of the things that were coming up for you as you were sort of listening to this, not just as his partner but also as a researcher and a worker in the field?
Well, I actually hadn't done a lot of work in the space at that time. It's sort of as we've got more involved in the show, and the show came to us. We were at Adelaide Fringe watching just a series of cabarets, and we actually met. I was Rusty's manager for a while, and he was a singer. And then we kind of eventually acknowledged, oh wait, I think we're in love, so we'll just do that instead and combine all the things. But it was actually through the process of putting the show together. We were in Adelaide, we'd seen all these things, and I'd always got some advice when I was in school studying performance art that write about a topic that that you have a unique insight into that other people don't. And so we said, as weird as it sounds, Russ, you're an amazing singer. You have this really amazing story that hasn't been told. Why don't we turn it into a musical cabaret? That sounds so insane that it's either going to work or be terrible. Luckily, I think we made it work. But so it was through that process over the last 5 years that, we've been a part of some of the earlier conversations in this space. We did the show up in New South Wales with the ACON Anti-Violence Project up there. And New South Wales has had a lot more time in the sector doing stuff specific towards LGBTI victims. When we moved down here to Victoria, we realized that the sector here was a decade behind, really, but where pretty much the rest of the world is. And so, there was some services doing some good work, but it had never been drawn together in the same way that the interagency up there had. So, then the Royal Commission happened, and all of a sudden everything was on the table, and the attention was drawn towards LGBTI as priority victims for the very first time. And things have just skyrocketed since there.
How much of this show is about coming to the table also, as opposed to, or perhaps in addition to, your love for music and performing and cabaret and...
Look, it's all part and parcel. Performance was what I'd done and I'd loved for many years. The subject matter was something that we both believe just needs to be discussed. Cabaret, well, cabaret has always had has always been something where you take something out of the ordinary, something political, something that needs to be discussed that's not discussed, in the general populace, and you put it on stage and you build something out of that. So this was the perfect platform for us to discuss a subject that people just don't want to talk about.
And I think for us, we'd seen some really good education campaigns put out in New South Wales, and posters and educational videos and things going out into the space. And what we think was missing and still is missing is, and what we provide is a real emotional connection to not only what these things look like, but what they feel like on the inside. And I think that's what the show does really successfully. Is you join Russell on the story, you get to, it smashes the myths that the victim is somehow weak, or choosing the situation, or why don't you just get on with it and go and leave. And it really shows you how when you're in the middle of these situations, you can't see the woods from the trees anymore. And the abuse tactics that are used on you belittle your self-esteem to the point where you don't see a doorway out, and you start to believe that this is what you deserve. And so I think with music and with the true personal story, you can't deny. Most people, when we say we're doing this show about queer domestic violence, they go, that happens to queers? We never knew that. I've never thought of that. You can't deny it when it's a big, hairy bear guy standing up there going, I was a victim. It's real.
With the emotional connection that this show aims to do, is to connect with the audience emotionally, we're talking about some pretty grim experiences and some pretty intense feelings.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
Is that the intention, to invite the audience into that space where they go? Well, you said they go on that journey with Russ. Do they go to those places with you?
If I'm doing it well, if I'm performing well, not performing is a really bad word. If I'm taking people with me and doing it well, then they're experiencing all the things that I experience.
Why do you want us to go there with you, Russ?
Because that's the best way that you will understand. And you know, the purpose of this show is to create understanding. It is a journey, and it's a show where people need to feel the things that I felt and that other victims or survivors of domestic violence feel.
Because Russ, I'm thinking, you said earlier that you kept this to yourself. You didn't talk to anybody. You know, we in the queer community, we don't talk to anyone. And it's just interesting. So I wonder if taking us to that place with you, getting very close to that place, means that you're not actually alone. If the audience sort of being there with you, does that also mean that we're there with you? Is there somehow something cathartic in there for you?
No. In all honesty, this is not the sort of show that you can do unless you're healed. I can't use this as a vessel to assist my healing process, because it would destroy me. I have to go back to those places every single night that I do the show to be able to take the audience there with me, and that's not something that you can do if you're not healed.
Right.
But it's a really important journey for people to go on. Because it creates understanding, and understanding is what we're really trying to have people be to understand.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think what we know is that a lot of service providers or professionals who have an obligation to screen for domestic violence, there's cases that we know of that people have point blank described very clear domestic violence, with children involved, abuse of a partner and the children at once. And because it was two women, it just was not clocked as DV. And even though there were multiple disclosures. And so what we know is also that's happening to people's family and in their friends and in their workplaces, and really clear stuff is people are seeing it. And because it's not a man and a woman, we don't have the same triggers to go, wait a minute, that's not okay. We don't have 2 decades of awareness raising that has helped Australia move from where it was in the 70s or 60s, where it was, okay, of course it's fine for a man to beat his wife. We've certainly moved on from that, but we haven't had the same dialogue around LGBTI domestic violence.
If you've heard something in our conversation today that makes you think perhaps you're using control or abuse in your relationship, you can contact VAC at vac.org.au or QLife.
If in our conversation today it's made you think about anyone you know, maybe a colleague or a friend or a family member even, that this sounds like could be happening in their relationship, please head to qlife.org and speak to a volunteer counsellor about what you might be able to do to help that person. Or you can go to anothercloset.com.au and have a look at the information there for how bystanders can help someone experiencing violence.
If anything in our conversation today has made you realise that maybe you're in a domestic violent relationship, contact Queerspace. They have a specialist LGBTI domestic violence support worker available to talk to you today. Alternatively, call QLife and talk to a volunteer counsellor.
So this is more than a show. This is a campaign. This is a protest. This is a celebration about resilience and survival. And this is a screening tool also?
Well, certainly we have a few audience members in mind. I mean, we want it to be entertaining. It would be, we've all been to bad, community theater or, you know, educational theater pieces where you're just like, oh, here's the key messages again. Oh yeah, okay, here's the script telling me what I need to know. So we were really conscious of not doing that, of, you know, you do come out knowing more about the topic, and you know, we've specifically included messaging in there for, if you are a person experiencing this, this is your pathway out. If you see this in your friends or relatives, this is what you can do to help them. You know, those messages are in there, but they're in there in a way that you're being entertained, and it's starting a dialogue, and you're motivated to care. And when you see those things in the future, hopefully you reflect and you go, I remember what it felt like in the room to watch Russ have that experience. I remember when he talked about, you know, having those conversations with his friends and them not doing anything. I'm going to do something different in this situation. That's what we want.
Is that the learning and understanding that you're talking about?
I really want people that come and see this, that tweak one thing that comes out of this show, so that, you know, if they see something like that with their friends or their family or whatever, that, you know, they make the approach. They don't do the whole let's pull back. You know, be brave. Be brave. Go and talk to them. Ask the question, because ultimately they may not be ready for it at that point, but they know you're interested. And so when they are ready to talk, they will go and seek you out.
That's exactly right. I think we talk about it, the metaphor we use is just drawing circles around it. And I think that's really important. We know that, you know, if somebody says, I don't like your boyfriend, you should divorce them, you should leave, that, you know, that person has a lot, love is a complex thing. They have a lot of emotions attached to that person, and they have been trained to defend them and defend the situation and try to cover it up. You know, really the victim is the strong one in a lot of ways. They're the ones trying to make it work. They're the ones keeping it all together, you know, in the face of some really horrible stuff going on.
If you've heard something in our conversation today that makes you think perhaps you're using control or abuse in your relationship, you can contact VAC at vac.org.au or QLife.
If in our conversation today it's made you think about anyone you know, maybe a colleague or a friend or a family member even, that this sounds like could be happening in their relationship, please head to qlife.org and speak to a volunteer counsellor about what you might be able to do to help that person. Or you can go to anothercloset.com.au and have a look at the information there for how bystanders can help someone experiencing violence.
If anything in our conversation today has made you realise that maybe you're in a domestic violent relationship, contact Queerspace. They have a specialist LGBTI domestic violence support worker available to talk to you today. Alternatively, call QLife and talk to a volunteer counsellor.